November 12, 1944. 0617 hours. The forested ridge east of Chevenhut lay under a cold mist that clung to branches and settled into the torn earth like a second skin. The American push into the Siegfried line had stalled again. The Hurtgen forest absorbed sound, light, and momentum. Every movement felt slow. Every breath tasted of wet pine and cordite. The men of K Company, 112th Infantry Regiment, crouched behind the ragged edge of a shell crater 40 meters from a reinforced German pillbox that had halted their advance for 3 days. The structure sat embedded into the hillside, its front face angled to deflect direct hits. Its firing ports covered the only approach corridor that engineers judged workable. Mortar fire had failed. Satchel charges failed. Flamethrower teams failed. Every failure dragged another stretcher back through the trees. Sergeant Arlo Kincaid watched the bunker through a break in the fog. He tracked the rhythm of its firing port. 2 seconds open. 2 seconds closed. A short burst. Pause. A shift in angle. The Germans inside had a disciplined crew. Their MG-42 raked the treeline with precise arcs that cut through leaves and tore apart bark. Kincaid counted each burst. He counted the distance from the crater to the shadowed steel frame of the firing aperture. He counted the number of men left from his original squad. 6 remained. 2 were wounded and unable to move. 10 had already been carried back over the past week, some silently, some gasping and shaking in the cold. His eyes did not move from the pillbox. His mind worked in the same quiet way he once planned a forge layout or shaped a piece of hot metal. Distance, angle, pressure, weak points. Arlo Kincaid had never expected war to feel familiar. Yet certain moments echoed his life in rural Pennsylvania. He had spent a decade as a blacksmith in a small valley town where most families worked farms, repaired equipment themselves, and relied on a handful of craftsmen to solve problems that weather and time created. He had learned to trust the behavior of metal. He understood how iron spread under force, how heat traveled unevenly, how casting flaws created hidden vulnerabilities. He also understood the blunt truth that no amount of doctrine replaced understanding the nature of a material. This mentality carried him into the army. Officers noted his calm approach when equipment failed. They noted his improvisations. They also noted his habit of questioning official tool limitations whenever the situation demanded solutions that manuals did not offer. Pillboxes across the Siegfried line presented a problem that doctrine handled poorly. Engineers trained to use standard demolition blocks packed in canvas satchels. These charges were intended for door frames and timber structures. Concrete resisted them unless they were placed in direct contact with a structural seam. The firing port of a pillbox, reinforced with steel and angled concrete, often survived repeated explosive attempts. The only reliable method was to approach under covering fire and place a large charge directly into the aperture. In the Hurtgen forest, where visibility collapsed to 20 meters and German defenders controlled overlapping kill zones, closing that distance was close to impossible. Kincaid had watched 2 engineer teams attempt it in the last 24 hours. Neither team reached the wall. The battalion staff issued strict warnings against improvised charges. Several men had attempted to modify standard explosives to increase pressure concentration. Some attempts caused premature detonations. Others created shrapnel hazards for friendly troops. Kincaid understood the concern. He had argued the same point when younger apprentices in his shop tried shortcuts with casting molds. A flawed container increased risk. A misaligned vent created unpredictable stress points. Yet he also understood that controlled containment multiplied explosive force. A shaped container directed energy rather than letting it disperse. He knew this from years heating iron kettles, pans, and tool housings. He saw it now in the battlefield's failed demolition attempts. Charges placed against flat concrete bled outward. They did not push inward with enough pressure to fracture the reinforced aperture. He had spotted discarded iron kettles near the field kitchen 3 days earlier. Cast iron, thick-walled, stable under heat, dense enough to hold shape during an explosive flash. The idea formed quietly. He tested the metal with a small hammer. No internal cracks. He checked the curve of the kettle. It funneled force toward its center. He understood that if packed tightly with composition C2 and set flush against an aperture seam, the kettle might channel the blast forward in a narrow cone. It would not equal a true-shaped charge. He had no copper liners or precision geometry. But it could magnify pressure at a single point for a fraction of a second. Enough to shear steel framing or fracture outer concrete. Enough to create chaos inside. He brought the idea to Lieutenant Harlan 2 days earlier. The officer listened, frowned, and dismissed it. The battalion had already circulated a warning about improvised containments after another unit lost 2 men to a mishandled container charge. Harlan forbade it. He told Kincaid to stay within regulation and await engineer support. Kincaid returned to the line with the same steady expression he used when customers refused practical repairs in favor of cheaper, unsafe fixes. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply observed the next assault fail. Then the next attempt. Then the morning a flamethrower operator burned at the edge of the corridor because the pillbox survived another satchel charge attempt. The November fog hung heavy that morning. The forest absorbed the shock of nearby artillery. The pillbox did not waver. Kincaid studied the burned debris near the firing port. The last satchel charge had been placed too low. The blast scraped the outer lip but did not penetrate. The Germans inside resumed fire within seconds. He watched the concrete dust settle. He listened to Captain Bremer argue with the engineers about withdrawing again. He watched the wounded shivering against tree trunks. A thought settled in his mind. No standard tool solved this problem. No additional weighting would reduce casualties. The only workable solution demanded a focused blast delivered directly to the aperture, and the only way to deliver that blast involved a container capable of directing force. He understood metal. He trusted metal. He trusted the kettle. He prepared the device in silence. He packed the charge in layers to reduce air gaps. He braced the fuse housing using 2 pieces of salvaged scrap to control detonation angle. He tightened the lid with wire bracing to hold structure until the blast wave burst it forward. Every movement mirrored old years at the forge. Every check matched the routine he used when testing tension on a new tool head. He hid the device under his coat and waited for the fog to thicken. He waited for the gunner inside the pillbox to commit to a firing pattern. He waited for the corridor to fall quiet except for distant artillery rumble. He waited until the moment felt as precise as a strike on hot metal cooling too fast. When the chance came, he moved from the crater and crawled 20 meters through wet leaves and shattered branches. He kept his profile low. He timed each push with the MG-42 bursts, closing the distance in measured intervals. The pillbox loomed above him, its concrete surface slick with morning frost. The steel lip of the firing aperture sat 1 arm's length higher up the wall. He held the kettle under his chest, pressed it against the ground and waited again. His breathing slowed. His focus narrowed. The firing port opened for another burst. The gunner shifted angle left. Kincaid rose 3 inches, placed one hand on the wall, and prepared for the final movement. Kincaid lifted the iron kettle with both hands and pressed it against the lower right edge of the firing port where concrete met steel. He felt the cold surface bite into his palms. The kettle sat flush against a seam that engineers had identified as structurally weaker due to imperfect casting during German construction. He did not know the specific numbers. He only knew the texture. Concrete that had cured unevenly felt different under pressure. It carried a faint powder residue when chipped. He had noticed it 2 days earlier when a stray rifle round struck the wall and produced a crumbly residue instead of a sharper fracture line. His thumb brushed that spot now. He aligned the kettle's most curved surface toward the aperture so that the blast energy would channel inward. He pulled the igniter cord. A sharp click followed. He pushed the device tight against the aperture frame. No more than 2 seconds passed between the click and his shift into a low dive away from the wall. Another second passed before the explosion hit. The blast was not large in open-air terms. It did not echo like a standard satchel charge. It did not throw dirt across the forest floor or produce the rolling thunder that soldiers expected from high explosives. Instead, it created a short, violent flash that concentrated its energy forward. The cast iron body of the kettle contained the initial detonation for a fraction of a second. Then the pressure surged through the open mouth of the container. A cone of force smashed into the steel aperture ring and drove splintered concrete inward. The sound resembled a punch rather than a roar. A hard, sharp impact that cracked through the pillbox interior. Inside, the German crew experienced something closer to shock than destruction. The blast forced air, debris and concrete dust into the narrow firing space. Several fragments struck the gunner and loader. The gunner yelled something short and guttural. The machine gun's barrel jerked upward and fired a brief, uncontrolled burst against the pillbox ceiling. A corporal inside attempted to stabilize the weapon but inhaled concrete dust and coughed violently. The team lost situational awareness for several seconds. Light from the blast temporarily blinded anyone facing the port. The kettle's curved body had shattered into small iron shards that rang against the inner wall, adding to the confusion. Outside, Kincaid rolled behind a fallen spruce trunk and waited for the return fire that did not come. The gun had gone silent. He lifted his head just enough to see the aperture. Its right edge sagged inward. A visible fracture line ran from the top corner down to the midsection. A section of steel frame had bent inward by 1 or 2 inches. He had hoped for a clean breach. Instead, he had created something more useful. He had disrupted the gun crew and compromised the structural integrity of the firing port enough to allow a second assault team to get close without immediate suppression. Lieutenant Harlan, stunned by the abrupt quiet, stared at the damaged pillbox and did not yet understand what had happened. Kincaid rose from behind the stump and raised his hand. Harlan's expression shifted from confusion to shock. He recognized the iron kettle shape among the debris. He opened his mouth to shout but stopped when he saw the firing aperture sag again. A crack widened. Dust sifted out in a thin cloud. The bunker crew inside shouted orders in urgent tones. Kincaid signaled Corporal Finch and Private Delaney. Both men carried fragmentation grenades and moved along the left flank where the slope offered partial cover. They reached the wall faster than usual due to the lack of MG-42 fire. Finch lobbed 2 grenades through the distorted aperture. The explosions inside produced muffled blasts and a heavy groaning sound from the structure. Smoke pushed out of the fractured seam. Delaney secured the lower edge of the port and shouted that the gun had collapsed inside. For the first time in 72 hours, the pillbox showed signs of breaking. Kincaid approached the wall in a crouch. He examined the fracture line in the concrete. He traced the bend in the steel frame. He touched the powder from the shattered interior. Everything matched what he had predicted from his experience as a blacksmith. Contained pressure multiplied force. Directed force exploited weaknesses. Imperfect casting turned into an entry point when struck with shaped energy. This was not a shaped charge in the doctrinal sense. It was a crude directional blast. But it worked. Lieutenant Harlan reached him at the wall. The officer spoke in a tense whisper. He demanded to know why Kincaid had disobeyed orders. Kincaid did not answer immediately. He kept studying the damage with slow, deliberate movements. He then turned his head slightly and told the lieutenant that the wall would not hold if they pressed now. He urged immediate entry before the defenders recovered. The lieutenant hesitated. He carried responsibility for lives and feared another ambush. But he also saw an opening that had not existed before. Moments later he nodded and signaled the squad forward. 2 riflemen moved to the left of the port. 2 more moved right. Kincaid positioned himself against the wall where he could listen through the fracture. He heard groans, coughing, and the scraping of boots against concrete. No coordinated machine gun operation. No reload clicks. No defensive shouts calling range. The defenders were disorganized. The blast had done its job. Kincaid pushed himself through the widened port after the entry team cleared the immediate angle. Inside, the pillbox smelled of smoke, dust, and hot iron. The MG-42 lay twisted against the inner wall. The loader lay unconscious near the ammunition belt. The corporal responsible for the crew had been thrown sideways by the grenade detonations and struggled to raise himself. Kincaid directed the squad to secure both inner corridors. 1 man moved to check the ventilation shaft. Another covered the emergency escape entrance. No additional defenders appeared. The bunker fell within 30 seconds of the initial breach. Outside, Captain Bremer received confirmation that the pillbox had been cleared. He walked from the command post with a mixture of disbelief and irritation. He knew the casualty numbers for the past week. He knew the engineer's warnings. He also knew that something unexpected had just broken a position that resisted artillery, satchel charges, and repeated infantry assaults. When he reached the bunker entrance, he stopped and examined the fractured port. He saw the iron shards. He saw the bend pattern in the steel. He recognized improvised containment. He called Kincaid out of the pillbox. Kincaid emerged with dust covering his coat and helmet. Bremer questioned him. Kincaid explained the logic behind the kettle. He explained the pressure dynamics, the containment effect, and the reason the blast had pushed inward instead of dispersing. Bremer listened without interrupting. His expression shifted from anger to reluctant understanding. He asked 2 more questions. Kincaid answered with precision and quiet confidence. Bremer ended the conversation with a stern reminder about orders, but he did not issue punishment. The results spoke louder than regulation. Word spread down the line that the pillbox had fallen. Men who watched the repeated failures of standard charges asked what happened. Some heard the term kettle. Some heard directional blast. Others heard blacksmith trick. No one heard the full explanation. They only saw the enemy gun silenced and the corridor open for advance. The forest remained quiet for 15 minutes. Then German mortars resumed. The company prepared to move again. But the mood had changed. A position once seen as immovable now lay cracked and silent. Kincaid stood near the shattered aperture and studied the pattern one last time. The results matched his expectations. He had solved a material problem through material knowledge. He felt no pride. Only relief that his squad still stood. The company advanced 20 meters beyond the first pillbox before enemy fire from the next ridge forced them back into cover. The terrain funneled movement into predictable lanes. German defenders positioned machine guns to exploit these lanes. Every forward step strained American momentum. The infantry crouched behind torn roots and shattered logs while artillery observers attempted to pinpoint the next bunker. But fog drifted across the treetops again, and the forest reduced visibility to a gray sheet. The advance halted. Kincaid checked his remaining equipment. He carried a standard rifle, 2 fragmentation grenades, a utility knife, and the few tools he always kept in his pack. One of those tools was a small iron punch. Another was a narrow file. Old habits prevented him from leaving them behind. They weighed little and solved problems that manuals rarely anticipated. He wiped mud from his gloves while listening to Lieutenant Harlan argue with artillery about the coordinates for the next strike. The lieutenant's frustration grew. The enemy bunker sat deeper into the hillside than the first. Its firing angle covered a longer section of the valley. Artillery shells risked landing close to friendly lines. Engineers again advised satchel charges. No one believed they would work. The first Kettle blast had changed perceptions, but it had not changed doctrine. High command demanded consistency. Improvised solutions remained unofficial. Yet soldiers at the line recognized practical value when they saw it. Corporal Finch approached Kincaid while adjusting his helmet strap. He asked if another Kettle could be prepared. Kincaid answered with a simple statement. He needed another container of cast iron. He needed time to check the structural seams on the next bunker. He needed to know the exact thickness of its aperture frame. Finch nodded and left without another word. Within minutes, 2 riflemen returned from the rear carrying 3 discarded iron pots from a supply dump that had been hit by shell fragments earlier in the morning. One pot had a fractured rim. Another had a warped base. The third looked intact. Kincaid inspected them by tapping each with the end of his knife. The fractured rim produced a dull tone. The warped base produced an uneven vibration. The intact pot gave a clean, sharp ring. He selected that one. Finch watched him work and asked how he could tell the difference. Kincaid replied that metal spoke if someone listened long enough. He crouched behind a fallen pine and checked the pot's curvature. It was shallower than the Kettle used earlier but still capable of directing blast energy. He measured internal space with his thumb. Enough room for a compact explosive mass. He then checked the fuse slot on a spare block of composition C2. It would require modification. He would need to bore a narrow channel in the pot's side to anchor the fuse housing. He used his file to scrape a small groove. The sound was faint but predictable. He carved until the fuse fit snug. Lieutenant Harlan approached again. His jaw was tight. He asked whether Kincaid understood the risk. Kincaid answered with the same simple explanation he gave earlier. Containment-focused blast. Direction determined effect. Material behavior guided design. The lieutenant listened with impatience but did not forbid the attempt. He knew that the next bunker needed to fall. He knew artillery could not strike reliably. He knew the engineers had no new solutions. So he allowed Kincaid to continue but insisted the device be used only after a formal plan was set. By midday, fog thickened and light faded under heavy cloud cover. German machine gun fire raked the tree line at irregular intervals. The sound of rounds tearing through fir branches reminded the men that time mattered. The battalion planned a coordinated assault in 1 hour. Engineers would advance with satchel charges along a shallow gully. Rifle squads would move along the left flank. The objective was to reach the second bunker's wall, place charges and pull back before the gun crew recovered. The plan resembled earlier attempts that failed. Kincaid watched the preparation and felt the same quiet calculation that guided him during the first assault. Standard methods would inflict casualties without guaranteeing success. His directional blast offered a chance, not certainty, but a better chance than a satchel pressed against a flat surface. While officers finalized plans, Kincaid asked Finch to accompany him to a vantage point 70 meters from the second bunker. They crawled through soaked underbrush until they reached a gap where the hillside angled downward. The bunker sat half buried in earth and stone. Its firing aperture pointed down the slope. The steel frame appeared reinforced with thicker plating than the first structure. Concrete seams were darker. Moisture beaded along the surface. Kincaid studied the texture. This bunker had been built with higher quality concrete. The Germans likely expected heavy resistance here and invested more construction time. That meant fewer natural flaws. His improvised charge would need to be placed with greater precision. He tracked the firing pattern again. Short burst, long burst, pause, reload sound, shift in angle. German crews rarely changed rhythm unless pressured. This crew remained confident. The forest had given them that confidence. American attempts across this section had failed for weeks. Kincaid examined the field around the port. No scorch marks from earlier flamethrower attempts. No crater from satchel charges. Engineers had not reached this wall. The problem was clear. The bunker sat too high and too far for a standard rush. He returned to the company line and adjusted the pot's internal packing. He tightened the fuse clamp. He shaped two thin metal strips into anchor braces that would hold the pot against the aperture frame. The strips came from a broken ammunition box hinge. He had saved them days earlier without knowing why. Now they served a purpose. He shaped them with careful pressure, bending the metal around his knee until they curved evenly. He slid them into place inside the pot and tested stability. The pot held firm. When the battalion signaled the start of coordinated movement, the forest erupted with small arms fire. Rifle. Squads advanced along the left. Engineers crawled through the gully. German defenders opened with immediate bursts. The MG-42 in the second bunker hammered the treeline with relentless accuracy. Men dove for cover. A satchel charge team advanced 10 meters before one man was hit in the shoulder and fell. The second man dragged him back under fire. The charge remained unused. Officers shouted adjustments. Mortars shifted aim. Nothing brought the bunker's fire under control. Kincaid watched from behind a tree stump. He counted the intervals between bursts. He studied the slope. He measured possible approach angles. He weighed the risk. Then he spoke to Finch in a calm voice. They would move during the next pause in the firing cycle. Finch nodded, adjusted his rifle and took a deep breath. Kincaid held the pot under his arm and waited for the moment to align with the gunner's rhythm. The next pause came 3 seconds after a long burst. Kincaid and Finch crawled fast across the wet ground, using exposed roots and craters as stepping points. German fire resumed but angled 10 meters left, targeting the engineers instead. Kincaid used the distraction to close the distance. They reached a low depression 35 meters from the bunker. The firing port loomed above them like a narrow black rectangle carved into concrete. The pot felt heavy against his ribs. The noise of the MG-42 rattled through the ground. They waited again, pressed into the mud, silent and motionless. The ground trembled under each burst from the MG-42. Dirt slid down the slope in thin streams. Kincaid pressed his hand against the pot to keep it steady. Finch kept his eyes on the aperture and counted under his breath. The gunner fired in strict intervals. The timing did not change. This predictability created the only safe window to move. Kincaid watched the barrel flash. He felt each burst as a vibration through the soil. He waited for the next pause. When the firing stopped again, both men crawled 10 more meters. The distance felt longer because the slope pulled them downward. Mud clung to their sleeves. The smell of burned powder drifted across the ridge. A mortar shell landed behind them and shook loose branches, but the shock did not break their focus. They reached a shallow ditch 15 meters from the bunker. This was the last cover before open ground. They breathed slowly to keep their hearts steady. Kincaid studied the firing port again. The steel frame looked thicker than he expected. The concrete around it showed no clear weakness. A standard blast would not crack it. His pot had to be pressed directly into the seam. Even a small gap would reduce the effect. He guided Finch's eyes to the upper edge of the port. Moisture collected there in a thin dark line. Water seeped into that seam. This hinted at a small flaw. Kincaid saw a slight discoloration. He trusted his reading of material texture. He knew this seam was their target. The gunner fired another long burst. The echo carried across the forest. Finch counted the seconds again. He signaled the next pause. Kincaid moved first. Finch followed close behind. They reached the base of the bunker wall. They pressed their bodies against the cold concrete. The surface felt damp. Tiny beads of water broke under their gloves. The firing port was 2 meters above them. They had to climb. Kincaid looped the pot's handle around his wrist and placed his foot into a shallow crack in the wall. He had climbed rough stone many times at the forge while repairing chimneys and tool racks. He applied the same calm method now. He shifted weight slowly. He reached upward and felt a second crack. Finch braced him from below. The pot hung against his forearm with its fuse facing forward. If the gunner looked down, they would die. They moved fast but silent. He reached the level of the firing port. He could see the faint light inside. He could hear the gunner reloading. He pressed his shoulder to the wall. He raised the pot. He aligned the mouth of the container with the weakened seam at the top of the aperture. He pushed until he felt metal grip against steel. He slipped the 2 anchor strips into position. They locked the pot in place with tight pressure. The fit was not perfect. It was close enough. He pulled the igniter cord. A sharp click followed. He dropped down from the wall. Finch pulled him into cover. Both men pressed against the ground. Kincaid counted the seconds in his head. The detonation hit on the 3rd count. The blast was tighter than the first Kettle charge. The pot's shape created a focused shock that punched into the steel frame. The explosion produced a sharp metallic crack. The frame bent downward at the top edge. Concrete dust sprayed outward in a fine cloud. The gunner inside shouted. The machine gun fired an uncontrolled burst that struck the ceiling of the bunker. A belt of ammunition spilled across the floor. The loader fell backward from the percussion. The corporal hit the inner wall while trying to stabilize his footing. Outside, Finch lifted his head and saw the crack widening. A thin wedge of concrete broke loose and fell. The firing port sagged. Smoke drifted from the fracture. Kincaid stood and examined the deformation. The blast had forced the upper seam inward. This partially exposed the inner chamber. Enough to allow a grenade. Finch pulled a grenade, pulled the pin, and tossed it through the distorted opening. The blast shook the bunker again. A second grenade followed. After the smoke settled, the MG-42 fell silent. No return fire came from the aperture. Kincaid climbed the slope and reached the port again. The frame hung crooked. The concrete around it crumbled under his hand. He widened the gap by pushing with his shoulder. The frame gave way. Finch climbed beside him. They both pulled the steel ring downward until it cracked free on one side. They entered the bunker. Inside, smoke still floated in the air. The smell of burned propellant filled the space. The MG-42 lay overturned. The gunner lay slumped against the wall. The loader did not move. The corporal tried to raise his rifle but dropped it. Kincaid ordered Finch to secure the inner corridor. A second team entered behind them and checked the ventilation shaft. No more defenders appeared. The bunker fell within 40 seconds of the breach. Outside, rifle squads advanced up the left flank. The engineers moved through the gully without machine gun fire blocking them. Captain Bremer received confirmation that the second bunker had fallen. He arrived at the entrance with 2 radio operators and stared at the damaged port. He recognized the pattern again. He saw the bent frame. He saw the pot fragments. He saw the precision of the placement. This was no accident. This was deliberate. He asked Kincaid how close he had been to the blast. Kincaid answered with steady calm. He stood close enough to place the pot accurately but far enough to survive. Bremer inspected the crack again. He shook his head. He called over Lieutenant Harlan. Both officers studied the damage while speaking in low tones. They knew the tactical value of what they saw. They also knew the implications. An improvised device had succeeded where standard charges failed. Word spread quickly across the ridge. Men spoke in short sentences. They asked about the pot. They asked how it was built. They asked if more existed. No one questioned its effectiveness. They had seen results with their own. The advance, halted for weeks by 2 bunkers, now moved forward. Kincaid remained quiet. He checked the pot fragments still clinging to the frame. He studied the break pattern. The pot had fractured in predictable lines. The blast force had followed the curve. Everything worked as he expected. He felt no excitement. Only confirmation that his understanding of metal behavior translated to this battlefield. The battalion advanced again before dusk. They moved deeper into the forest. Artillery fell behind them. German mortars answered. The trees shook with each exchange. The men pushed forward with deliberate caution. They reached a 3rd ridge where 2 more bunkers guarded the slope. The day ended with another stalemate, but morale had shifted. Soldiers believed the next bunkers could be breached. Kincaid sat against a tree and cleaned mud from his gloves. Finch sat beside him and asked if he could teach the method. Kincaid explained the basics. Cast iron. Curved containment. Tight packing. Flush placement. Direct seam contact. Finch listened carefully. He understood only part of it, but he understood enough to know that this method saved lives. Night settled over the forest. The air grew colder. Mist rose again from the ground. The line fell quiet except for distant artillery. Kincaid closed his eyes for a moment. He pictured the next bunker. He pictured its seams. He pictured the pot he would need to build. He did not think of medals or recognition. He thought of reducing the loss of his men. Fog settled low across the third ridge on the morning of November 13th. The forest looked darker than the day before. The smoke from distant artillery mixed with the mist and turned the air into a thick gray curtain. K Company moved slowly along the slope while scouts tried to locate firing ports on two new bunkers ahead. The terrain narrowed into a funnel. Fallen pines and shattered stumps created natural choke points. German machine gunners positioned inside the bunkers controlled these points with overlapping fields of fire. The placement was deliberate. The defenders had built these fortifications to create layered kill zones. Kincaid crouched behind a splintered oak trunk and studied the ridge through gaps in the branches. He could not yet see the firing port of the nearest bunker, but he traced the angle of incoming bursts. The Germans targeted a specific corridor along the slope. That told him the bunker sat at a height where the gunner could adjust fire without exposing the aperture to direct rifle shots. He listened to the length of each burst. He counted the seconds between volleys. He mapped the timing in his mind. The rhythm was steady and controlled. The crew showed experience. Finch knelt beside him and adjusted the strap on his helmet. He asked if another pot charge was possible. Kincaid answered with a short nod. He needed another cast iron container. He needed time to examine the bunker's seams. He needed the angle of the firing port. Finch understood. He signaled two men to search supply areas for usable containers. Ammunition boxes, ration crates, and discarded cooking gear lay scattered behind the line. Soldiers brought back 4 items. 3 were dented. 1 was intact enough to work. Kincaid inspected each with calm precision. He tapped them with his knife. 2 produced dull tones. 1 produced a rattling vibration from internal cracks. Only 1 gave a sharp, even ring. He chose that one. The pot had a wider mouth and thicker walls than the previous kettles. This shape would create a broader blast cone. That might be beneficial. The firing port on the next bunker was likely recessed deeper into concrete. A wider cone would increase internal disruption. He filed a small groove for the fuse housing. He shaped 2 anchor braces from a broken rifle sling buckle. He tested the pot for structural flaws by pressing its rim against a rock. The metal did not bend. He packed explosive material inside and removed visible air gaps. He checked the fuse connection twice. Then he set the pot aside while scouts reported the exact position of the new bunker. By midday, scouts returned with details. The bunker sat higher than the previous 2, nearly embedded into the ridge. Its firing port pointed down the slope at a steep angle. This gave the gunner a clear view of the entire corridor. Engineers attempted to advance under cover of smoke but retreated after 2 men fell to sustained fire. Mortars could not reach the recessed bunker without risking friendly lines. Rifle squads tried a flanking approach but thick underbrush blocked movement. The bunker held control of the ridge. Kincaid and Finch crawled forward to a vantage point where they could observe the structure through a cluster of blackened tree trunks. The firing port looked narrower than the earlier pillboxes. Its steel frame extended outward in a shallow lip. This lip protected the aperture from angled shots. The surrounding concrete looked smoother. Moisture had not penetrated the seams as visibly. The Germans had constructed this bunker with greater care. That meant fewer weaknesses. Kincaid studied the lip carefully. He tracked how the concrete curved into the steel frame. He saw no discoloration, no powder residue, no cracks. He told Finch that the pot would need to be placed directly under the lip to concentrate the blast upward. A vertical strike might lift the frame and fracture the concrete above it. Finch nodded but understood the risk. They would need to get close under heavy fire. Both men returned to the company line. Lieutenant Harlan reviewed their findings. He understood the tactical challenge. A satchel charge would not be effective unless placed directly under the lip. No engineer could reach that position without being hit. He gave Kincaid permission to attempt his method again but reminded him that no official record would support improvised charges. Kincaid accepted this without reaction. His concern was the ridge and the men who would climb it. The battalion prepared for a coordinated assault. Smoke shells would cover the lower slope. Rifle squads would advance left and right to draw fire. Kincaid and Finch would move up the center during the brief moment when visibility blurred the gunner's aim. Timing mattered. Precision mattered. Survival depended on both. The smoke barrage began at 1,430 hours. Thick white plumes rolled across the slope. The MG-42 opened fire immediately, cutting through the haze. Tracer rounds sliced the smoke in bright streaks. Rifle squads exchanged fire with German positions. Mortars thumped behind the ridge. The air filled with debris. Kincaid held the pot under his arm and signaled Finch forward. They crawled through the smoke in a straight line, guided by the rhythm of the gunner's bursts. They advanced 10 meters at a time, dropping flat whenever the gun shifted angle. The bunker loomed above them as a dark rectangle against the smoke. The firing port spat bright flashes. Each burst shook loose dust from the slope. They reached a depression 25 meters from the bunker. The smoke thinned and revealed the lip of the firing port more clearly. Kincaid studied the seam again. He repeated the same quiet assessment he had made in the previous assaults. He measured the distance. He timed the interval between bursts. He prepared to move. When the gunner paused to reload, both men rushed forward. They crossed the final stretch in fast, controlled movements. Bullets snapped overhead. Dirt sprayed around them. Finch slid behind a boulder. Kincaid reached the base of the wall. He pressed his body into the concrete. The firing port sat 1 meter above him. He could hear the gunner preparing the next belt. Kincaid lifted the pot. He pressed it under the steel lip. The anchor braces bit into the seam. The pot held firm. He pulled the igniter cord. A sharp click followed. He dropped to the ground and pressed against the slope. Finch covered his head with his arm. The explosion struck upward. The pot contained the blast for a brief instant. The energy traveled through the mouth and punched into the steel lip. The frame jolted. A sharp metallic crack echoed. Concrete dust sprayed outward. A fracture appeared along the top edge of the port. The gunner inside shouted in confusion. The next burst fired into the bunker ceiling. Several rounds ricocheted within the chamber. The sound inside turned chaotic. Finch threw a grenade through the widened gap. The blast shook the bunker again. A second grenade followed. Then silence. Kincaid climbed the slope and reached the port. The crack widened enough to allow entry. He pushed inward. Finch followed. They entered the bunker. Smoke filled the chamber. The gunner lay across the broken belt. The loader did not move. The corporal struggled to rise but stopped when Kincaid aimed his rifle. The bunker was secure. Outside, rifle squads advanced again. Engineers followed without machine gun fire blocking them. The ridge opened for the first time in days. Kincaid stepped out of the bunker and looked at the fractured lip. The break pattern confirmed his prediction. Metal under upward pressure behaved exactly as he expected. He wiped dust from his gloves. He waited for the next ridge. Night covered the forest with a cold stillness that settled into every trench and crater. The advance up the third ridge left the men exhausted. Supplies arrived late. Artillery continued sporadic fire on distant positions. The battalion prepared for another push the next morning. Officers gathered under a makeshift canvas sheet to review maps of the Siegfried Line. The line ahead showed more fortifications, more concrete nests, and more interlocking guns that waited for the next attempt. Kincaid sat apart from the group while working on his gloves with a cloth. His hands smelled faintly of metal dust and explosive residue. Finch approached with 2 canteens. He handed one to Kincaid and lowered himself onto a log. He asked if Kincaid believed the next bunkers would require more charges. Kincaid answered without hesitation. The terrain dictated the methods. If the apertures were recessed, yes. If the seams showed moisture, yes. If the steel frames carried tension irregularities, yes. Finch nodded with quiet respect. He understood only part of the reasoning but understood enough to trust it. The next morning, November 14th, the battalion advanced again. The forest grew denser. German fire intensified. Machine gun bursts echoed between trees. Mortars dropped near the forward elements. The line stopped near a fourth ridge where 2 heavy bunkers guarded a narrow gully. Engineers prepared satchel charges again. Officers planned flanking routes. The mood worsened. Captain Bremer approached Kincaid. He asked for an honest assessment. Kincaid studied the ridge, listened to the firing angles, and observed the slope. He declared that standard methods would produce casualties without securing the ridge. He explained that an aperture-focused blast was the only reliable approach. Bremer exhaled slowly. He ordered Kincaid to begin preparing additional containers. For the first time, officers formally allowed his improvised method. Soldiers gathered discarded cast iron from wrecked supply points. 3 pieces were usable. Kincaid examined each with the same quiet, exacting process. He tapped them for tone. He checked the rims for flaws. He chose one for each bunker. He prepared them with care. He packed charges tightly. He shaped anchor braces from scrap metal. He carved fuse grooves with the tip of his file. Finch assisted with each step. At noon, the battalion launched its assault. Smoke covered the gully. Rifle squads moved along the left flank. Engineers advanced cautiously. Kincaid and Finch crawled toward the first bunker. The firing port spat rounds in long bursts. The pattern revealed slight hesitation between belts. Kincaid used this timing to reach the wall. He pressed the pot against the aperture seam. He triggered the fuse. The blast struck inward and cracked the frame. Grenades followed. Riflemen cleared the chamber. The bunker fell within seconds. The second bunker required more caution. Its firing port sat higher and deeper. 2 bursts raked the slope before the smoke shield settled. Finch drew fire from the right while Kincaid moved from the left. He reached the base of the wall. He planted the pot beneath the frame. The blast lifted the steel lip and fractured the concrete. A grenade cleared the entrance. The bunker fell. The ridge opened. Word spread through the battalion. Men spoke of the blacksmith from Pennsylvania who broke pillboxes with kitchen iron. The stories varied. Some called it a kettle charge, some a pot blast, some a directional strike. Engineers requested details. Officers recorded notes. The technique began to circulate through nearby units. No doctrine existed for such a device, but soldiers fighting in the Hurtgen understood its value. Improvised containment reduced casualties. Improvised containment shattered hardened defenses. By November 16, the battalion reached the outskirts of Gressenich. The worst of the ridge fighting was over. Casualties were heavy but fewer than expected. The improvised charges had opened corridors that standard tools failed to breach. The men who witnessed the method carried it forward. They taught it to other squads. They adapted it with their own materials. Pot metal, cast iron pans, damaged kettles, even broken field stoves became containers for directional blasts. Kincaid received no commendation. His method remained unofficial. Reports mentioned successful assaults but not the devices that made them possible. Regulations prohibited the use of improvised charges, and no officer wanted to document violations. But every soldier on the line remembered. They saw the difference. They saw the reduced stretcher lines. They saw bunkers broken that once seemed immovable. When the forest fighting ended in December, Kincaid's squad had suffered losses but remained intact. Finch credited him for their survival. Kincaid disagreed. He said the terrain dictated the solutions. He said the metal behaved as expected. He said nothing more. After the war, Kincaid returned to Pennsylvania. He reopened his blacksmith shop. He repaired farm tools, shaped iron gates, and crafted equipment for neighbors who remembered him long before the war. He did not talk about the Hurtgen. He kept no souvenirs. He hung none of his service photographs. He returned to shaping metal with quiet precision. Those who served with him carried the story forward. They spoke of a man who understood metal so well that he reshaped the battlefield with tools never mentioned in manuals. They spoke of an iron kettle that broke a pillbox. They spoke of a skill that saved lives. They spoke of Sergeant Arlo Kincaid, who saw weakness in concrete where others saw only immovable walls.